If you actually know ancient history, the Palestinians are rooted in the Philistines, and they're the ones that came over the water from the Greek islands. If history means anything, if you think that's relevant.
Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley in Context, and my guest today is Dr. Craig Evans. Dr. Evans is a well-known New Testament scholar. He's a prolific author. He is a very popular teacher and speaker. He's taught and lectured in North America and around the world, 90 books and counting, authored more than 700 popular and academic papers and publications. He's best known for his contribution on the Gospels, the historical Jesus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and archaeology related to the New Testament. He contributes to many documentaries, television, radio, podcast interviews. He's a go-to in the above-mentioned subjects. He also leads tours in the Holy Land, as well as consults for the National Geographic Society, Museum of the Bible, and many others. On a personal note, Dr. Evans is just a really nice guy. Sometimes scholars can be a little stuffy, Craig, so I just wanted to throw that in there. So today we're talking about his book, A Handbook on the Jewish Roots of the Christian Faith. Now, Craig, this is a contribution of a lot of authors, different subject matter experts, and I went through and read their bios. Did you put this list together?
I did it with David Mishkin. David Mishkin's in Israel. He's at the Israel College of the Bible. It's in Netanya, beautiful beach resort town, filled with Israelis, obviously, but many of the Jewish people are from either Russia or France. So it's odd. It's like you're walking around Europe. And so
I spend time in Netanya. Next time I go, I need to find out the location of this. I'd love to see it.
I pro bono. I teach, for free. I'm not paid anything, but they treat me really nice. They put me in a high rise overlooking the beach.
What's not to like?
Oh yeah, and I get out in the water, swim. I love the Mediterranean, and so it's really nice because we have Jewish Christian students, but also Palestinian Christian students side by side. And I tell you, Michael, every time I go away, I think, here's the Middle East peace plan.
Yeah.
This is what brings peace. It's the Prince of Peace. Henry Kissinger and everybody can do their best, but I mean, the real Prince of Peace is the one who brings peace to the Middle East, which isn't there now, of course. And so it was really impressed on me in these years of pro bono teaching there how important the Jewish roots are. And that's where David Mishkin teaches. And so I've gotten to know him and his colleagues. They're great people. And he contacted me a number of years ago for both of these books that we just mentioned about the Jewish roots. And I said, yeah, we got to do this because we have far too many Gentile Christians who are very inadequately acquainted with the Jewish backdrop, the Jewish roots of Christian faith.
And sadly, at least in my experience, some of the messianic kinds of ministries can be a little bit slanted too far one way or another. And it adds a layer of confusion, which is why I appreciated and reading through the bios of these contributors. There's some solid folks you have contributing, which, to me, when I read a book, I was talking to another guest about the bibliography, I wish I had several lifetimes because these are the 12 books that they reference, and I don't have time to read all those books to see where they, factored in. But that's what scholars do. I'm just a consumer, Craig.
Yeah. Well, we obviously compared notes. We came up with a list of the topics. First of all, what kind of things should be covered. One of the big decisions, do we have a whole lot of topics that are a little bit shorter or fewer topics that are much longer? Because, the size of the book, it has its limits. The publisher has to be
that's one thing to interrupt. That's one thing I like about this, because this is a scholarly text, but it's accessible. And this is where I think a lot of scholarship fails, is they're writing for other scholars, and the likelihood of that getting beyond a very small population is nil.
Well, you touched on another issue, and Michael and I, or David and I had to discuss that. That's what's the level, and we talked it over with the publisher too. And exactly as you said, we wanted it to be accessible. So you might say the average layperson, somebody with 1 or 2 years of college education, perhaps. They don't have an MA in theology or Bible. They can't read the Greek or the Hebrew or anything like that. They're not necessarily seminary trained. And they could pick up the book and they could read any of the entries and understand it. And of course, somebody with seminary education, a pastor or a seminary student, can access it even better and get even more deeply into it.
Well, I appreciated it from both levels because, again, I see where you're going with these topics, but it's also, I had a professor, Dr. Alan Ross, a Hebrew professor, and he often said, talk to a 12th grade educated person in your exposition.
That's right.
If you can't do that, you're failing because you get lost in salvific and, all these big words and, they don't know what you're talking about. So let me jump in. I want to talk about the Abrahamic covenant. And I learned a lot reading those chapters because, Craig, I've always said this is the whetstone on which we sharpen theology. If we don't understand what God did in this covenant with Abram, everything falls apart.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And by the way, the author of that particular chapter really knows his stuff. That's Seth Postel. Seth, by the way, is a Dallas Seminary grad, and he is the dean, or for a number of years was the dean at the Israel College of the Bible. Good friend. We stay in touch, including in this difficult time. And he knows that stuff inside and out. He's an expert on the Pentateuch. He has books not only on Abraham, but on Adam. He understands that thoroughly. And if you don't understand the Abrahamic covenant, how are you going to understand what Paul is talking about, particularly in Romans 9, 10, 11, where he's talking about, we have the Gentiles and a whole bunch of them are coming to faith, and that's great. There is a hardness of heart with Israel right now, but Paul goes on to talk about how they have the covenants and the fathers, and the day will come when all Israel will be saved. And you don't understand what's being said there if you're weak on understanding these covenants in Genesis, and that above all includes Abraham.
Explain a little bit for folks that may not understand a unilateral covenant and a bilateral covenant. I've this has been a soapbox of mine for 4 decades, but I'd love to hear it from the scholar, Dr. Evans.
Well, there are several covenants in the Old Testament. And the question then is always, do they all go right on through? Like you can start off with Noah and the flood. You've got God summoning Abraham and then repeatedly, saying your land, seed, and blessing is going to be for you. You have then the covenant at Sinai, which is with the whole Abraham's descendants, the people of Israel. And then you have, I'm getting a little out of order. You have the Davidic covenant. There's a covenant that God makes with David, namely that your descendant will be on your throne forever. And then you have the promise of a new covenant. And that's where it gets really touchy about, okay, now wait a minute. Does this, and I come from a background that I see Israel as still God's people, the ethnic, genetic descendants of Abraham, which I think is what Paul says too. Jesus can talk about his kahal, his ecclesia, his congregation, made up of all believers. That would be Israelites, Jews, Gentiles, and everybody. And I think, the Great Commission at the end of Matthew has that in mind. But I don't see Israel as pushed out of the picture. I do not think of the church as the new Israel. I know Paul makes an analogy at the beginning of Romans that can mislead, like who's the true Jew? If you're going to talk about election, it's going to be the person who has faith in God and honors God and obeys God, believes in God.
Which goes back to Abraham. He believed God and was reckoned him as righteous.
And of course, what does he do with that? Genesis 15:6. He makes that point in Galatians chapters 2 and 3 and in Romans 4 that and that's to open the door to Gentiles. They can be just like Abraham. Abraham became, in a sense, you might say, the first Jew because of his faith. Well, I
Right.
don't think that ends. I don't think that disappears. I think that goes right on through. And otherwise, why does Paul have to talk about grafting in the Gentiles into this tree?
Right.
He doesn't say God has planted a new tree. And this one is a Gentile tree which has roots into the Gentiles. The Gentiles are grafting.
By the way,
in.
That's a great argument against replacement theology. Then,
Yeah, no
because
kidding.
if it was,
I agree.
if we're replacing it, we wouldn't graft it.
And
That'd be
I
a new
do
orchard.
believe, I think I'm remembering correctly when I was talking with David Mishkin, and of course we were going around and around on the title, but he wanted that word roots in there
Yeah,
because of Romans 11.
I love it.
And Paul's saying, look, guys, Gentiles, don't brag. Don't, like, oh, it's all about us.
Exactly.
Remember that it's this olive tree into which you have been grafted has its roots, its trunk and roots in this Jewish soil. And so I see continuity. I don't see Israel pushed aside. I accept what Paul says, that maybe the majority of the Jewish people right now don't believe in its Messiah. But God is not finished with Israel. Someday all Israel will be saved. All Israel will come to faith. Right now, God is working with his church, which Jesus established, and it's a mixed congregation. It's Jewish and it's Gentile. That's how I see it. And, let the Calvinists and the Arminians and the covenant guys and everybody debate it. That's how I see it.
Back to the Abrahamic covenant for just a minute. When we talk about land, this is another one that, a discussion and sometimes an argument I've had with my Reformed friends. And, this land promise and ethnicity promise, you're a blessing to the world, ergo not just the Jewish population. And that's to me where the new covenant dovetails so beautifully with what Abraham was promised, what the new covenant establishes, and then, as Luke will write, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, most part of the world. So the ethnicity goes onward to the Gentile people. But back to the land for just a second. In Genesis 15, 17, 19, and when he shows them this land, and I forget which of your authors pointed out that both Abraham and Moses were prevented from seeing those lands, which I thought was, I knew about Moses, but it didn't dawn on me about Abraham, but be that as it may. These borders are critical.
Yeah.
And the understanding of land, and I often talk about the cave of Machpelah, the land deed was so important for Israel, for the Jew.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure, Michael, this bothers you no end. You hear in popular press, politicians, people who are influencers have things to say. They're so ignorant. And the chant, this was some months ago, but the unrest on campuses, which of course is returning now with the new school year, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, from the river to the sea. And of course, that's an ugly comment. That's basically Holocaust talk, is what it really is. It's just a new form of Hitler.
Yeah.
And I remember, I'm not going to get into the politics and the parties that are involved and all that sort of thing. I'll leave that out of this. But somebody saying, "Oh, I don't hate Jews. I just wish they would go back to where they came from." And I thought, what an ignoramus. And of course, when I say what I'm going to say right now, I'm not being anti-Palestine either. I know plenty of Palestinians, many of them Christians, by the way, and they're caught in the middle of this mess.
Sure.
But if you actually know ancient history, the Palestinians are rooted in the Philistines, and they're the ones that came over the water from the Greek islands. If history means anything, if you think that's relevant. Abraham he was from the Middle East, and he has relatives in the land of Canaan. He's going back to the land that God directs him to. And then, of course, the people end up, they're in the land of Canaan. Israel's established. They're down in Goshen. They're down in Egypt. They come back with the Exodus. So the Jewish people have a long history of in and out in that land in the Middle East. They are, in fact, Middle Easterners. The Philistines, which are the forerunners to the Palestinians, they're not. They're the ones that came across the sea. So I hear this, go back across the sea talk, like, oh, how ignorant can you be? Now, by the way, I say that's history. Palestinian people who have lived in that land for hundreds of years, they have every right to live there too, and they have every right to live in peace. But oh my goodness, Israel does have a historic claim to this land. It's not just theological, but it's historical and demographic. I mean, that needs to be said if you know your history.
Well, and that's a big if. We don't know history anymore. It's one of my big beefs. Now, you write in the New Testament use of the Old Testament, you observe the Old Testament is quoted or alluded to in every New Testament book, save Philemon and 2nd and 3rd John. And again, I think a lot of our listeners and viewers won't realize this.
No. So, 24 out of 27 books presuppose the Old Testament. By the way, the only reason those other three don't, they're real short, they're personal notes. They're not getting into theology at all. They're not really touching on questions of soteriology and election or anything like that. But I make the point there that the Old Testament is the Bible for Jesus' and early church. It is Scripture. I'm not going to name any names, but a popular preacher some years ago said, well, it's time for the Christian church to unhitch itself from the Old Testament.
Yeah,
that's the dumbest thing anybody could say. And you're an educated seminary person, you're an influential pastor, large congregation, and you're talking like that? That's so dumb. Can you imagine,
yes,
walking up to Jesus and the 12 and saying, hey, guys, it's time to unhitch from the Old Testament? They wouldn't know what you're talking about. That would be the dumbest thing in the world. And like I said at the top of the program, how do you understand Paul when he's talking in any of his letters, never mind Romans, in Romans chapters 9, 10, 11, and you think, well, let's just ignore the Old Testament. It's out of date, it's obsolete, it's embarrassing. And he's saying that, as you know why, because of Old Testament ethics, sexual ethics, and that sort of thing. If we unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament, then we just as well, obviously this book for that kind of thinking has no value. We're just saying we're going to unhitch from Scripture and find our own way and make it up as we go. And in which case, we're no longer biblical, we're not even Christian.
Well, this is a much bigger conversation than one I often talk with my guest about, how biblical theology is absent from many seminaries and tragically most pulpits today. That, whether it's the algorithm or it's the audience polling or it's relatability or whatever, we're a far cry from, the dinosaur era where I grew up in. John Hanna told me a few months back, Michael, we were educated in a time that no longer exists. Yeah. I'm still trying to recover from that one. Now,
I know.
Now, again, our viewers and listeners may not know this, but you're a leading scholar in the Dead Sea Scroll arena. And specifically, you point out in one of the chapters you write how the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's say, underscore a lot of our New Testament theology. Could you expand on that a little bit for a lay audience? Because this gets into a pretty deep ocean to talk about this.
Oh, yeah. There's several things we could talk about. First of all, the scrolls would agree with what I was saying a moment ago, that Old Testament Scripture is Scripture. And so the authors of these scrolls, and many of the scrolls are written by the people we call Essenes. Other scrolls were written by other people, and so it's a library. But I believe that the Essenes don't put books in their library that they disagree with. And so you can see the books over my shoulder. There are a lot of books on those shelves. I do agree with them. There are a lot of books on those shelves. I don't agree with them. And so the Essenes have a coherent library. They're either books they themselves have written about how the law should be obeyed, how the holidays should be observed, etc. They're very concerned about purity, Sabbath, and other kinds of temple worship and so on. But they're also very interested in eschatology, what the future holds. They're very focused on when the Messiah comes and what's going to happen. And they end up interpreting some key texts pretty much the same way that early Christians do. They think that Numbers 24:17, the star that rises from Jacob, is messianic. They think Isaiah 11, the shoot from the stump of Jesse, is messianic. We all agree. They think the oracle in Genesis 49, the oracle that Jacob, the patriarch, gives to Judah, they believe it's messianic. We do too. So you get a lot of agreement, but I'll tell you what blows me away is in one of the documents that we don't think they wrote, but it's very, very in line with their thinking, and that's in K4. And some of our listeners don't know that K4 was the mother lode, over 600 documents of the 900 plus total documents from Qumran. 600 of them were from K4. Well, it's document number 521. It's in fragments, but there's a large fragment that says when the Messiah comes, heaven and earth will obey him. And it goes on to talk about how he will open the eyes of the blind, he will heal the wounded or sick, he will raise the dead, he will proclaim good news. And interpreters have rightly pointed out not only the parallels with Jesus himself and what he says to the imprisoned and discouraged John the Baptist, that go back and tell him what you're seeing, I'm opening the eyes of the blind. But 4Q 521 from Qumran is based on Psalm 146, verses 5 through 8, where it says, Yahweh created the heavens and the earth and everything in them. He will open the eyes of the blind, etc. Do you realize, Michael, this text is saying that when the Messiah comes, he will do what Yahweh does? He will have the authority of the Lord. And you realize that's what the Gospels say. Jesus in John says, I'm here to do the works of my Father who sent me. That's what Qumran believes that. Qumran has, we didn't realize that before, but a very high Christology. My goodness. Messiah will actually, the heaven and earth which Yahweh created, will obey the Messiah, and he will do what Yahweh is said to do in Psalm 146. That's an astoundingly high Christology. Yeah. Now, this has all changed since I was a PhD student. When I was a PhD
let me interrupt. So, do you think the Essenes, some of them connected those dots?
I think they did. Okay. They would not have accepted a document. They wouldn't say, "Oh, this sounds like paganism to us." You mean the Messiah is divine? Are you kidding? Get rid of it. No, because we have another document at Qumran. It's in Aramaic, 4Q 246. So it's from that same cave. This one is just a single piece. It's about that size, 2 columns, 9 lines each. That's all that survives. And what does it say? It's a vision that some king has had, a Jewish king, and he's troubled. And a Daniel-like figure says, King, here's what your dream means. You saw somebody, he will be great. He will be called Son of God. He will be called Son of the Most High, and he will reign forever. And you realize, I think I've heard that before. And that's Luke chapter 1. It's what Gabriel says to Mary. Well, now we know, so this one called Son of God who will be great, he will command the elements themselves. And you look in the Gospels, and Jesus commands the storm to be still. Yes. It is still, and the disciples about fall over themselves and say, who then is this that even the wind and waves obey him? See what I mean? He walks on the water, and they're just stunned. We've never seen anything like this. Well, Qumran is expecting a Messiah like that. And so that's really opened our eyes to this idea that, no, the Messiah is just some guy like David who's going to kill some Romans, and that's about it. Whoa! There's a dimension to the Messiah at Qumran that's every bit as high and exalted as you see in the New Testament.
Yeah. Your chapter, you talk about the man in John 9, the Jewish life and identity of Jesus. I remember years ago teaching that passage, and I went back into Isaiah 35:5. The eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. And correct me if I'm wrong, but these were miracles reserved for Messiah. And this is why the Jewish leaders were so agitated with the unnamed blind man in John 9, because if it's true that he was congenitally blind and Jesus healed him, and that's a creation miracle, right? He spits, makes mud, puts on his eyes, and they're so unnerved by this, not so much the Sabbath breaking that you point out, but additionally, if he did this, he's Messiah.
Yeah.
And they understood that.
Yeah, and John's Christology is high, it's transparent.
Okay.
But it's turning out that the Christology and the Synoptics, which in the past people say, oh, it's kind of a lower Christology, it's just as high, it's just not quite as on the sleeve and as obvious in John, but it's the same high Christology. Because some of our listeners don't know this, but even liberal critics will say Jesus' reply to John the Baptist, it's in Matthew 11 and Luke 7, you can look it up. Even liberal critics say, oh yeah, that's authentic, Jesus said that. And they have good reasons for concluding that. They're not only correct, the reasons are good, because who's going to make up a story where John in prison has doubts about Jesus? Are you he who is to come, or shall we look for somebody else? And Jesus' reply is somewhat indirect. So if it's going to be invented post-Easter tradition, then John isn't going to question Jesus at all. And if Jesus is asked a question like this, he's going to say, of course, I'm the Son of Man, I'm the Messiah, I'm God's Son, blah, blah, blah. How can you doubt it? So for good reasons, they accept this as authentic. Now, thanks to Qumran, they realize it's a powerfully high Christological statement. So he is saying, yes, I am the Messiah, and I do what the Messiah is supposed to do. And oh, by the way, what the Messiah is supposed to do is the kind of stuff God does. So our Christology and the Synoptics just jumped way up.
It's remarkable. And to me, again, you're in a different league than I am, but as I studied the scripture over and over and over again, aligning these passages, whether it was, I think it's 5 times in Isaiah, it's pretty clear this is a messianic miracle. And then you already referenced Psalm 111. There's other ones as well where this was demonstrable. And then we think about the signs and wonders movements that are so-called in the New Testament. Just looking at Christ's miracles, they do nothing but authenticate this is who the Old Testament said he would be.
Yeah. And in the other book on the Gospels, we talk about each gospel. And the point is made, too, about in John, the signs Jesus does, right? And everybody says, oh, yeah, look at the Moses parallels. But folks, remember, it's God that does these things. Moses doesn't provide the bread. God does. And so what Jesus is doing, and John's got it right, of course, and again, it's such a high Christology, it's so transparent. Jesus is doing God things in the Gospel of John. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that from Moses. Yes, of course. But Moses didn't have the power to do those things. God did. And Jesus is now doing God stuff in his ministry.
Moses couldn't even hold the staff very long, right? I think that's one of the overlooked passages. This is man in his flesh. He can't even hold a stick over his head for any length of time. Backing up on the book a little bit, I love the way that you and Michigan outlined the roots, the trunk, and so forth and so on. Again, for folks that haven't got the book yet, tell them what your plan is on this. I love the order, in other words, the way you organized it.
Well, David Michigan gets a lot of credit for that. I have the table of contents right in front of me, and he organized the whole thing. I made suggestions. I added some of the subpoints that became small chapters. And by the way, that's what we ended up doing. Let's have a bunch of chapters and not have them real long. Cut to the chase, no long preamble about the history of scholarship. Just get right to it and nail it. And so the very first section, he calls it chapter 1, but it has all these subparts. It has 5 parts. The kingdom and the covenants. The Abrahamic covenant, which we've already touched on. The Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the new covenant. And that's Jeremiah 31, which is really important. And so then God's plan for the nations. Oh, yeah, that's right. These covenants with Israel don't leave the rest of the world out. The rest of the world is involved. Then chapter 3, again, with several sections of 4 individual chapters, you have the messianic prophecies. And so we walk through those. We have 6 subpoints under chapter 4, appointed times. These are important. And this is where a lot of Christians are weak. The Sabbath, the Passover, the feasts, Purim, Hanukkah, so we wanted to bring those in. This is all part of Jewish faith and history, and it impacts Christian expression, Christian theology too. The tabernacle and the temple. I mean, the ignorance here is so unbelievable.
Yeah.
I'm involved with Kevin Sorbo and an archaeologist named Scott Stripley on a documentary which I hope will be on television this coming year. It's on the history of the tabernacle and how we finally end up with a temple in Jerusalem. You got people that say, oh, there never was a temple there. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's part of Muslim apologetic recently in the last few decades. But you get the New York Times had an editorial saying, well, scholars aren't really sure if there was a temple. And I mean, I and a bunch of others pushed back and said, this is crazy.
Written from a person that's never been to Israel or gone under the so-called rabbi's tunnel.
Well, and do you see what that does? I mean, part of the argument that people want to destroy Israel, the justification for it is, well, Israel never really had a history here. These are just Europeans. That's back to they came over the water. These are people from Europe in the last 150 years that have invaded the Middle East, and they're illegitimate. They should be driven away. Well, back to the historical ignorance of the whole thing. And so, there's no temple. Oh, come on. That's so dumb. And current West Bank leadership says that.
Yeah.
And, come on, New York Times. I know you tilt way over to the left, but show some credibility and get your history right. So, but I've wandered away, but these are the kind of things we're talking about. And so it isn't just a book with some stuff in it. It directly relates to things happening in the world right now. So I could say that these essays are treating topics that really are a matter of life and death.
That's the reason I wanted to talk,
because they don't know this stuff.
And I wanted to talk to you about it because it's so pertinent. It's like a great time to pull this off the shelf again. Talk about you brought up the Sabbath, Eitan Bar's chapter. Talk a little bit about this because again, you made the comment, and I agree. Most Christians have no idea of how these history of them or implication of them, and I thought that was an interesting chapter.
Well, Eitan Bar is an interesting guy. And it's always fun to be with him. I've been with him several times in Israel, eating lunch and, talking. I've made all kinds of videos, too, that's in their library. And Eitan is usually the guy interviewing me. So he's a lot of fun. But he wanted to set the record straight on Shabbat and lift it out of this idea that it's just a bunch of legalism. Oh, there are things you can't do, And of course, he would be critical, too, of what Orthodox rabbinic Judaism has done with it. It has turned it into a burden. Jesus talks about it himself. Jesus respects the Sabbath, but he reminds his critics that the Sabbath was made for humankind. Human beings were not made for the Sabbath. It's not to be a burden. And by the way, that would apply, in my view, to the Ten Commandments. I have that as an opening lecture when I teach freshman intro Bible. You think, the Ten Commandments, all this stuff, you can't do. No, actually, it's like the first 10 amendments in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They're designed to protect you. They're designed to protect you from somebody who wants to steal your property because he has the power to do so. Mm-hmm. He wants to slap you around. He can beat you up because he has the power to do so. The Ten Commandments apply to the king just as much as they apply to everybody else. And that's what the Bill of Rights is designed for. A lot of people, unfortunately, don't get that. So what is the Sabbath then? Is the Sabbath to create a burden? No. Your employer can't make you work 7 days of the week. It's a day of rest. It's an opportunity to cease from your labors and give thought to your Creator. To give thought to your Creator who has given you all these things. Yes, of course, you've got the curse on Adam and Eve. You're going to have to work now. It's just not there. It's not just low-hanging fruit to pick. You're going to have to work now, but you still have a day of rest. And it reflects God's mercy and his grace when he gives us that time off. And you can use it wisely to rest, to be restored. and to meditate and give some thought. So there's a beautiful thing behind the Sabbath. It's not all supposed to be legalism and a burden.
Well, and the part that I had a professor at Dallas said that Sabbath was taking one day off a week was trusting God that you're more effective working 6 days than 7.
That's right.
And I was like, okay, that's genius. Why do we look? It's a freedom. It's a look back on what you accomplished, things you wish were different, things you maybe need to work at, enjoy the day, look forward to the week ahead. It doesn't have to be no labor whatsoever. Push a button in an elevator, as you and I well know, and can't do that in a Shabbat hotel, right?
But everybody's got to experience that.
I remember the first time over there, the King David, I was like, are you kidding me? Had all the 1960s technology in the hotel room for the alarm and the lights, and you don't want to start a fire, right?
No.
Well, our time's evaporating, sadly. Let me step back and ask you, as you've taught this in colleges and seminars and conferences and churches and podcasts, etc. What do you pick 2 or 3 issues that are really germane for you, and you wish people understood, the Christian understood, the integration of Old Testament theology and New Testament theology, and why this is so important, as you said, matters of life and death?
Well, I can think of a couple right off the top of my head immediately, and one of them is this idea that there is no grace in the Old Testament. And I wrote a small book. I wouldn't call it a devotional book, but it's at a light level little book on it. What is grace, or what grace is? And so what I do is I weave together the patriarchs, some of the patriarchal stories in Genesis, with some of Jesus's parables in Luke. And so that to me it's really on my heart. Please know that the God of the Old Testament is a God of grace, a God of mercy and forgiveness, second and third chances. And what correlates with that is, don't put the patriarchs up on a pedestal as though they're perfect people, because they're not.
Right.
And that includes Abraham, who 2 or 3 times significantly fails in the faith department and is dishonest. The matriarchs don't look real good either. And by the way, don't demonize the so-called bad guys. Esau is actually a very admirable character. Esau looks so much better than Jacob, and the way those 2 brothers are reconciled. I mean, Jacob is the sneak thief who has swindled Esau. So that's something. And so when you go to the Old Testament, don't think, this is just a bunch of old legalism and do's and don'ts. Doesn't have much relevance for today. There's no grace there. If you want grace, you have to go to the New Testament. That just isn't true. You can see the gospel on almost every page when you go through Genesis and the patriarchal narratives, and then right on into the Exodus and Sinai. God is a God of grace and forgiveness and mercy and love, and it runs throughout the Old Testament. Some of the most beautiful statements in the Old Testament. God wants obedience, not sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Samuel says to Saul, who just had such a hard time obeying what the Lord would instruct him in. Some of the statements in the prophets are just stunning. And so what you have in the New Testament is just saying, that stuff's already been said. Let me now apply it in a new context. And so that's something that I would really want to share with people, is quit thinking of the Old Testament as out of date and legalistic, but recognize that New Testament theology is embedded in it everywhere. And the New Testament writings simply tease it out, and especially in light of what Christ has done.
The book is called The Handbook on the Jewish Roots of the Christian Faith, and as Craig has just explained again, this is not a seminary text. It's a very accessible list of very short articles, and there'll be ones you'll go, I hadn't thought about that, and it's an easy read. It's got good bibliography on each chapter if you want to know more about that subject. Craig, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for your rigors to put the cookies on the lower shelf for the rest of us. And I pray your blessings on your teaching, your ministry for many, many years to come, brother.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.